Welcome back, everybody, to the fifth and final episode of Teddy Roosevelt TRUSTBUSTER, my reaction series to the Extra Credits, Extra History series of the same name. Hope you guys have enjoyed this. It seems like you have. It's nice to get a look at some things that aren't necessarily focused on war. I know that war is kind of the sexy history. It's the thing most people are interested in, myself included. But I'm always looking for ways to kind of stretch and learn new things and get outside of that box. If you are subscribed and you have notifications on, you may have seen my post last night. If not, do so now and check it out. I am looking for ideas along with the other original content that I do, whether it's the Forgotten History series, which seems to be picking up in terms of getting noticed, which is awesome. Thank you to all of you and welcome if you're new because of that. In addition to my historic site videos, which I've been doing, and I have more coming up soon, I also want to start experiencing some living history. And so I did a post yesterday asking for your help with ideas about places I could go to experience that. You know, where's somewhere I can go and fire a Civil War rifled musket for myself? Where's somewhere I can go and jump in a tank? And, you know, some of you have already given me some answers. There's a place down in Texas, I guess you can go for a lot of money and fire a Sherman tank and drive it around, stuff like that. So those are the kinds of things I'm looking for. Somewhere I can go and learn how to make soap like they did it in the 1500s, that kind of thing. So I'm looking for ideas of where I can go and experience living history, record that, and bring that to you on the channel. So if you have those ideas, find my post and reply to it, or reply right on here. That'd be great too. Let's go ahead and dive into this fifth and final part of Teddy Roosevelt TRUSTBUSTER.
Chicago, Illinois, 1904. Upton Sinclair has realized that, provided he carries a lunch pail, he can go basically anywhere, blending in with workers while walking the floors of Chicago's infamous slaughterhouses and packing plants, watching men work industrial meat cutters and grinders. His goal is to expose the grotesque labor abuses of the meat industry in a serialized novel he's writing for the socialist newspaper, Appeal to Reason. He sees workers lose fingers to saws and subsequently lose their jobs and financial security, witnesses the mistreatment of the largely Lithuanian immigrants working the factories, hears stories of men falling into meat grinders, minced with the meat, and sees foul droppings and diseased meat swept off the floor and put into sausages.
See, we take this kind of stuff for granted, that kind of thing doesn't really happen anymore. Now we know it probably does here and there, but by and large, we live in a society today where all of that stuff is closely watched and there are standards. But, you know, even 100 years ago, that wasn't the case. There really weren't standards for things. And this is, again, I don't want to get too far into the political realm of things, but this is where, regardless of where you stand politically, right, left, center, or anywhere in between, there are certain ways in which having government is helpful. Because certain regulations, I think, are no-brainers, right? I mean, regulations about things like this should be no-brainers, but they weren't 100 years ago. These were things that were fought against. These were things that had to be won and had to be, you know, these bills had to be passed, things that we have grown up always just accepting that certain things are okay. They weren't always.
The resulting novel, The Jungle, will spur Roosevelt's next big battle against the trusts. Thanks so much to CuriosityStream for helping to keep the history flowing. Despite being labeled a socialist by his conservative Republican rivals, Theodore Roosevelt in actuality had little regard for socialism. In fact, he was largely pro-business. Much like Ida Tarbell, he didn't particularly care how large the trusts got, provided they did it honestly.
Yeah, and that's an important distinction to make, and I think some of you maybe misunderstood me yesterday as implying that the government passing regulations was anti-capitalist. If I gave that impression, that was not my intention. I think there absolutely is a place for the government, like I said. And Roosevelt, this is a good distinction here. And this is where men of integrity come along. You know, he sees both sides of this. He says, you know what? We're a free country. We're a capitalist country. There should be freedom for people in business to do really well and succeed and become very wealthy, provided they do it within the rules. And here are the rules. You step outside those boundaries, we're going to come after you. And that's an important distinction. And if you have to pass new rules to kind of, rein them in a little bit, then you'll do that.
Actually, it could be argued that his reputation as a radical trust buster is undeserved, since he didn't really bust most of the trusts he went after. He was really more of a trust regulator. In fact, Roosevelt didn't believe trusts were inherently bad, and he often admired the charity work undertaken by captains of industry like Rockefeller and Carnegie. And anytime someone proposed actual socialist policies, like nationalizing the railroads, Roosevelt generally ran the other direction, because he disliked socialism and socialists, and as a result was skeptical of Upton Sinclair's claims when he first read The Jungle, particularly since Sinclair's novel ended with a heavy-handed scene of the protagonist attending a socialist meeting as a way to lecture and convert the reader.
And see, this is where it gets difficult, is that, and this is really true in today in our society as well. If we don't like the messenger, we often ignore the message. And sometimes we can disagree vehemently with the motivation behind something, disagree vehemently with the politics of a person, but we can agree with what they have to say. And I think that's something we've largely lost in this country. If it's not the guy you voted for, anything he does or says is going to be bad. Anything that the person you voted for does or says is going to be good no matter what. And we've lost the ability for nuance and to understand that, some people, you might disagree with them, but like them. I'll give you a perfect example of this. And again, not trying to get into politics, not trying to defend people. But, George W. Bush, for example, here's a person that was very polarizing politically. And to this day, even many years after his presidency, that's the case. But by and large, you talk to the people who were his opponents on the Democratic side, they all liked him personally. They just didn't like his policies. And they were able to distinguish between the two. Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill was the Democrat Speaker of the House, had a very good relationship personally, even though they fought like cats and dogs politically and in public. They respected each other personally. I think we have a hard time doing that anymore. And it seems like Roosevelt was having a hard time with Upton Sinclair's work, even though there was truth to what Sinclair was saying, but because of how it was packaged coming from a socialist, he had a hard time accepting it.
Despite that, he invited Sinclair to the White House to talk about the book and the conditions in the meat plants. Of course, he thought Sinclair was exaggerating and even referred to him as a crackpot. But if just a third of what Sinclair claimed was true, then that meant there was something very wrong in the nation's meat industry.
And this, again, says a lot about Theodore Roosevelt as a person. He may have thought, this guy's nuts, and probably everything he's saying is exaggerating, but he was responsible enough and a man of integrity enough to say, I should at least talk to him. Let's meet face to face. He didn't go out publicly and just trash the guy and say he's nuts, he's stupid, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He met him face to face, man to man, and talked about it, and asked him questions and decided to learn. That's what people should be doing.
The picture of poverty, exploitation, and the revoltingly unhygienic practices he'd painted in The Jungle was so viscerally upsetting to the public that both domestic and international orders for American meat dropped by half. So despite his skepticism, Roosevelt dispatched a group of his most trusted government officials to inquire about plant conditions. Surprise inspections, which the Meat Trust unfortunately got wind of and went on a 3-week sanitation campaign. But even that wasn't enough. When Roosevelt received the subsequent report, he was shocked to discover that Sinclair had not lied about factory conditions. They discovered unbelievable filth, from walls painted with old blood, to tuberculosis-infected beef being packaged for sale, to rotting pork being bathed in preservatives like formaldehyde and borax, to meat that was entirely mislabeled, passing off goat or horse as beef. Popular fury was so intense that this was one blow against the trusts Roosevelt wouldn't even have to fight for.
So imagine going to your local supermarket and getting what you think is ground beef, and really it's goat meat, or it's got tuberculosis in it, or it was done in these horrible conditions, just filled with bacteria. We assume that our meat is good, and you see the stamp on there, USDA and things like that. Boy, those are the kinds of things that we have Theodore Roosevelt to thank for.
He drew up 2 bills for the 1906 Congress. The first was the Pure Food and Drug Act, a wide-ranging statute that banned the foreign and interstate traffic of mislabeled, impure, or contaminated food and medicine. It allowed for the U.S. Bureau of Chemistry, later renamed the Food and Drug Administration, to carry out inspections and refer violations to prosecutors. It also required the food and drug manufacturers to label major ingredients, a provision striking out at both mislabeled meat and the U.S. patent medicine industry, which regularly sold products with secret ingredients.
So this is a big blow to the snake oil salesman, right? You can't just sell things without disclosing what's inside of it.
That included cocaine and opium. In fact, many of these medicines were also loaded with sugars and flavoring, which led to a rash of children overdosing when they drank the bottles like candy. It also labeled 10 substances common in medicine, including alcohol, opium, cocaine, cannabis, and morphine, as addictive and dangerous, requiring that their presence be disclosed on the packaging. Products found in violation could be seized and destroyed at the company's expense, in addition to a fine. Next came the Federal Meat Inspection Act, which mandated Department of Agriculture inspections of every animal before and after slaughter, spelled out standards for sanitation at meat plants, and authorized the government to monitor operations. Despite these two victories, Sinclair himself was disappointed that people had fixated on food purity rather than the condition of workers.
Remember, he's a socialist, and so he really was motivated not necessarily by let's clean this up, but let's make things better for the workers. And Theodore Roosevelt, he wants to do the right thing, but he's also still a pretty pro-business guy. So he's going to shy away from the whole help the workers, it might be viewed as socialism, that sort of thing.
I aimed for the heart, he reflected, and hit them in the stomach. But even so, it was the end of an extraordinary legislative season. In fact, the 59th U.S. Congress was one of the most productive in history. In addition to the Pure Food and Drug Act, Meat Inspection Act, and Hepburn Railroad Rates Act, the 59th Congress also passed a key law regulating citizenship, an Antiquities Act allowing the president to declare national monuments, and chartered the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, which played a major role in developing American education. But despite all this success, it should be noted that the Food and Drug Act and Meat Inspection Act were compromises, watered down from what Roosevelt had truly hoped for. And compromise was something Roosevelt increasingly became familiar with during his last years in office.
But compromise is the story of politics, right? I mean, if you get everything you want, then you haven't had to compromise. If nobody's happy, then there's a good chance that you've come up with a good compromise. And again, that's something we've lost. We are in a world today where it's all or nothing. I either get it my way or I'm taking my ball and going home. We've lost the art of the compromise, unfortunately.
Because in the exuberance of his election night win in 1904, he'd made a promise that he now regretted. Having served nearly 2 terms due to McKinley's assassination, he had promised not to run again.
And today, he wouldn't have been able to run again, but those laws weren't in place at the time. We've since passed a constitutional amendment that if a vice president serves more than half of a term that he inherits because of the death or resignation of a president, that counts as his term. So the most a person can serve legally today would be 10 years as president. They could become president, serve the last 2 years, and then serve 2 full terms. But he was under no such obligation at the time. But he picks William Howard Taft, who I think was his Secretary of War, to replace him.
And while that freed his hand to be more active and take politically risky positions in his second term, it also meant that both the trusts and conservative Republicans knew that they just had to wait him out. In 1908, he proposed a bill to strengthen the Sherman Antitrust Act, but saw it shot down in Congress. He then tried to set up a National Bureau of Insurance in order to tame anti-consumer practices in the insurance markets, but that was dead on arrival as well. However, even without Congress, Roosevelt could effect change, sometimes merely by the threat of an antitrust suit. Andrew Carnegie's U.S. Steel, the most prominent steel trust, actually voluntarily agreed to an investigation by the Bureau of Corporations, and other large trusts agreed to cooperate as well. But there was one time he couldn't help but let the trusts win. November 4th, 1907, the White House. The country is in a panic. Stock market dives and the sudden crash of several trust banks, wiping out depositors' savings, have plunged consumer confidence. People are terrified, moving their money out of the market, and worse, withdrawing it from banks. If this continues, the entire system might collapse. But J.P. Morgan, a man Roosevelt has tangled with when he filed an antitrust suit over the Northern Securities Company, has a plan. You see,
J.P. Morgan has a plan. He always has a plan, kind of like Bismarck. So again, I've mentioned this in previous episodes, but if you want to really get into the story of men like Carnegie and J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller and Vanderbilt and others, The Men Who Built America by the History Channel is fantastic in telling you these men's stories and also showing how they're all connected to each other, because they all are connected to each other. They all either got rich because of one another or kind of competed against one another, but they all really kind of were a part of the same story. And yeah, I know the History Channel doesn't do a lot of history content these days, but when they do, it's usually pretty good, even if it's not always 100% accurate in what they're showing, at least on screen.
See, part of this new panic of 1907 had come from a large brokerage house, borrowing massive sums with the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company as collateral. But now that TC&I stock price was collapsing, if U.S. Steel purchased TC&I, it would calm the markets. However, U.S. Steel already owns 60% of the steel market and doesn't want to face an antitrust suit as a monopoly. So they ask for Roosevelt to sign off on it personally. They will save the economy, but in return, he can't go after them for the purchase. It's Monday morning. The stock market will open in an hour. Roosevelt has to decide fast. He has no choice. He agrees to let the deal go through. Ultimately, Roosevelt would use the Sherman Antitrust Act 40 more times during his presidency, more than his 3 predecessors combined.
So you see, again, this is an art of compromise. He has to do something to bail out the economy, and that means compromising on something he might otherwise have normally gone after. But, give credit to J.P. Morgan. He was willing to step up. Yeah, granted, it was something that was going to help him too, but it was also something that helped the country. And so it kind of worked out well for everybody.
And his ally and chosen successor, William Howard Taft, would use it 75 times. But while Roosevelt's battle against the trusts has become legendary, the results themselves were more mixed. As we mentioned previously, the breakup of Standard Oil, his biggest victory, may not have actually led to much more competition. In the 1920s, when Ida Tarbell wrote a retrospective article on Standard's breakup, she pointed out that over a decade later, the competition that the government had hoped to create hadn't yet materialized. Maybe, she suggested, it would take another decade for the results to truly begin to show. Indeed, in our modern day, we can actually see parts of Standard recombining via merger, with Exxon and Mobil joining forces. But it's important to note that even these megacorporations only have a fraction of the power Standard once had.
All the companies that were a part of Standard Oil that have since re-merged, and here's a perfect example of it. So right here, you can see the Standard Oil of Kentucky and Standard Oil of California became Chevron, became Unocal. They took on Qethsegol, and that's Chevron today. Standard Oil of New York, Standard Oil of New Jersey became ExxonMobil. They were Mobil and Exxon, and then those two combined. Standard Oil of Ohio, which of Indiana, became Amoco, and then Sohio, which are now a part of BP, and the Ohio Oil Company, which was renamed Marathon and is now Marathon Petroleum. So those are just a few examples, and there are actually far more than that. You can see how Shell came out of Standard Oil, ConocoPhillips. I believe that Sunoco is also in there somewhere. Here's another really good one that shows a whole lot more of it. Here's Sunoco and Shell and Hess and Pennzoil and Gulf and 76. Pilot comes out. I mean, look at all of that. And now they're merging and slowly becoming one company again. So kind of interesting to see how history comes full circle.
Particularly because they fear antitrust suits. Breakups are rare, but in 1982, AT&T was forced to divest itself of the Bell telephone system. A 1999 case came close to breaking up Microsoft, and as we wrote this series, the Justice Department filed an antitrust suit against Google, and the Federal Trade Commission, the successor to Roosevelt's Bureau of Corporations, filed another against Facebook. Which just goes to show that even a century later, the big questions of Roosevelt's era still live on. Should the government provide a check on unrestrained capitalism? How can Congress regulate when its members are financially tied to companies? And what role does the press play in all of this?
Yeah.
Because while Theodore Roosevelt gave us the tools to act if warranted, the question of when to use them is still up to us.
So all excellent questions, and I think it's going to boil down to, obviously some of the big questions we're asking about that right now remain things like Facebook and Twitter and things like that. And it's really going to come down to whose side are they on and who's in power and who benefits from going after them versus using them as a tool to help their side and all those sorts of things. But fantastic series. I think it's something that we all need to learn a little more about. Coming in a few days is going to be a long series on the history of Turkey and the Ottoman Empire. So be watching for that, and also some more original content coming your way. Hope you enjoyed this. Please consider becoming a patron to support what we do. It would be greatly appreciated. And there's some great merch and things like that that you can receive in return. So thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.